And then the recorded webinars are going to be archived and posted on our project website. So that's waferx.montana.edu, and they are made accessible to all. Also, we have, for each webinar, we have some resources that are posted by the webinar speakers. They may be some books that they mentioned or some articles they mentioned or other resources that they mentioned. So do check out the previous webinars for some of the readings that Professor Sweeney Winchief mentioned during his webinar, as well as an assignment that he uses for sort of enhancing thinking about story work and positionality. We have a great set of webinars coming up, so please do join the Teaching Food Systems Community of Practice listserv for future webinar registration information, and that you can email teachfoodsystems@gmail.com to get put on the listserv. Also, there are many other excellent webinars that are happening, and I just wanted to bring attention to the Hunger for Justice series, and specifically in celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day next Monday. Growing Culture is hosting a full day set of events through their Hunger for Justice series, celebrating Indigenous voices as well as the fight for food sovereignty. So I would encourage you all to check out their website and those archived webinars as well on food justice. I wanted to pass it to our collaborators at Columbia University, the Teaching Community Food Systems listserv. If you have any updates that you wanted to share or announcements.
Sharon, do you want to jump in? It's Sharon. I'm happy to. It's Sharon Akabas, one of the co-coordinators with Eleanor Sterling from the American Museum of Natural History, and Erin Bentley, and the wonderful people who are going to speak today. We can't wait to be back in person. Our hope is to still be potentially optimistic for something this summer. If not, we'll just keep moving forward with the initiatives that are described on the Community of Practice website. So if anyone is interested in receiving future announcements or joining, we have subcommittees moving forward for planning. We welcome all of you.
Thank you. And I wanted to just bring attention to our next webinar, which is later this month, and it builds on some of the themes that Professor Sweeney Winchief had mentioned. We have Ren Walker Robbins from Salish Kootenai College of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes here in Montana. We'll be giving a webinar on diversiform storytelling, thinking about or presenting a pedagogical model, or thinking about diverse ways of bringing different voices into learning. And that will be happening on October 22nd, 2 p.m. here in Montana, 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and 4 p.m. On the East Coast. I know we have participants on this call from Hawaii as well, so I think this later time will allow you to not join so early and not get up at 6 o'clock for the webinar. So hopefully this time of the next webinar will work for everybody. And I wanted to now pass it on to our speakers who are going to be presenting the development of an equity, competency, and sustainable food systems education. This is based on a paper that they published earlier this year in the journal Elementa, specifically the Sustainability Transitions section of Elementa. And as an associate editor for Elementa, I wanted to encourage those of you who are looking for an outlet for your work in food systems and sustainability to consider this platform. I now wanted to pass it on to our speakers today. We have Royal Valley from the University of British Columbia, Sharon Akabas from Columbia University, Pamella Koch from Columbia University, Joanne Burke from the University of New Hampshire, and Nicole Tichenor Blackstone from Tufts University. And I have made all of you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. And I'm going to stop sharing mine.
Thanks so much, Selena. I think I still need co-hosting access, if that's all right, and I'll share my screen. Perfect, thank you.
We are getting a little bit of background noise, so for those of you who are not speaking, I would appreciate if you could put your mics off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Selena. It's incredible. So I work with Selena on a few projects, and it's incredible how much she does. I really appreciate your capacity to host a webinar as well as amongst all the other things you're doing, Selena. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, Pamella Koch couldn't join us today, but Molly Anderson is going to join us in the discussion today. So we're going to talk briefly about our equity competency model, kind of exploring the new model, and then sharing teaching activities. We really appreciate this opportunity and your willingness to join us for the webinar. Overview, quick introductions and acknowledgements. We'll do a bodywork activity to begin with. Before jumping in, I'll speak a little bit to our equity competency model, what it emerged from and how we developed it, and then pass along to my colleagues who will each take about 5 minutes or so to give specific examples of how the equity competency model is appearing and relates to their teaching activities and assessment strategies. And we hope to leave enough time for some open discussion towards the end, as well as closing statements and another bodywork activity to send us on our way for the rest of the day. So for our session outcomes here, what we're hoping for you all that you would get out of this is that to be a bit more familiar with our proposed equity competency model and connect some teaching activities, examples of teaching activities to multiple dimensions of the model. We hope you'll feel more confident in integrating issues of equity into your own teaching practice. And we're also hoping that this is part of an ongoing and broader connection to a network of educators committed to the development of future food system professionals capable of dismantling inequities in the food system. Although there'll be 5 of us speaking today, we have 10 folks that are project collaborators and authors on this paper that we'll be speaking to. So we just want to acknowledge there's not just the 5 of us. There's a lot more folks who have collaborated and put a lot of time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into the paper and the model, as well as its application. So it's just a few headshots and to acknowledge that there's a broader set of collaborators that we've been working directly with. But you'll be hearing from a few of us today. Few quick disclaimers. The authorship, we're predominantly a group of white folks on the authorship. So that limits our lived experience with some of these issues. And we acknowledge that limitation, and we are very honored to have collaborators who can help us work through the limitations of our lived experience and bring issues of equity into our classrooms and our teaching practices. We're all situated in natural and health sciences, which is also another limitation to thinking through equity and dismantling forms of oppression in the food systems. Historically, natural and health sciences have focused on other areas of reality, and in some ways to the detriment of understanding, perceiving, and experiencing and working to dismantle forms of inequity. We're drawing upon, but not representing, scholarship from fields or disciplines or domains outside of our formal areas of expertise. So we really encourage feedback and commentary that helps us better represent and integrate, but we're not claiming to have deep scholarship and expertise in these areas. And we really appreciate, again, the effort that others are doing in other fields to go deeper into these topics. So the goal for us is really to bridge and integrate teachings from other areas to better support the development of future professionals capable of dismantling inequities in our food systems. And so that's really what the spirit of the paper is that, and the model is to recognize the limitations of our practices, of our ways of knowing, and to collaborate and bring that wisdom and teachings into our own practice. All right, another disclaimer, full of just a few disclaimers at the beginning. I'd like to begin with an opening bodywork activity. However, there's so much going on right now. If you've watched any of the debates recently, you might have noticed that your affect gets going, your heart rate, your sensitivities, your fight, flight, and freeze type of responses may be at their threshold right now. So if you're not really feeling, if you already experience microaggressions on a daily basis and you don't really want to sit through a webinar, you have 5 minutes of a webinar where you're going to experience a few more microaggressions and explicitly racist and sexist statements, now's the time to just mute me, go get a cup of tea, do something else. And when you see the welcome back slide, unmute and then join the webinar. But I will be making some statements intentionally on purpose to explore some affective responses. So if you're not really feeling like that's what you need today at this time, please feel free to mute and then come back when you see the welcome back slide. So first, I'd like to invite everyone to just to settle in, to check in, feet flat on the ground. You know, engage the core, straighten the back, shoulders down, chin slightly tucked in, and just take about, I'm going to put a timer on for 20 seconds to just breathe deeply and connect. So I have 8 statements that I've heard in my classrooms, in my student evaluation of teaching and learning, from colleagues, statements that come up often when we speak explicitly about issues of equity in our classrooms. So I'm going to say these statements out loud. While I'm saying them, I want you to notice any constrictions in your body, any tightness, any pain, maybe any emptiness. I want you to notice how your body reacts to these statements, to these topics, and where it sits. When we bring up these issues into our classrooms, which we must, in academia, we're often trained to think about the cognitive realm, the head, how are we thinking, but really these statements, these issues are felt in our bodies. And the affective responses that accompany them are as important as understanding the intellectual definitions, the terms and concepts. So I'm going to say these statements, and I want you to notice how your body reacts. And notice any shifts in your mood or in your energy or in your inner dialogue. So what's going on? That connection between mind and body. So here we go. I apologize in advance. These are harmful statements, but I want you to focus on how they land and where they land in your body. So the first statement. Why are we talking about race? I don't see color. No one I know thinks about race, and bringing it up in class makes everyone uncomfortable. White privilege and white fragility are racist terms and shouldn't be stated in our lecture. Women are more naturally suited to raising children and housework. That's why there's more men in high power situations and high power positions. It's just natural. I grew up poor, so I know what you're going through as an Aboriginal person. Why can't Indians just get over it? Colonization happened like 500 years ago. Move on. Maybe if you didn't act so gay, people would take you more seriously in class. The only reason that she got this job is because she's Black. I'm one of the good ones. I get it. I'm here to help. Just tell me what to do. So we want to notice any constrictions, any tightness, pain, any emptiness, and where is it in your body? Where are you feeling this? How is it impacting your mood and your energy? And your willingness to want to continue in this webinar, to debate, to argue, to fight back, or maybe to flee. So take maybe another 10, 15 seconds just to recenter. Connect back with your breath. And one of the messages and the key messages we want to remain from this webinar is that the topics that we are encouraging folks to bring into their classrooms, they aren't just intellectual topics, they have affective responses. And these affective responses impact our capacities to be present, to think clearly, to be able to develop coherent and ways of moving forward. And if we don't pay attention to the affective responses of ourselves and of our students when we address and bring up these issues, there's a real limit to how much progress we can make in our institutions, and there's a real likelihood of re-traumatizing or having vicarious trauma through our teaching practices. So I wanted to start with this activity for us to feel our feelings, feel our affect when we talk about these issues, and to think about ways that we can develop stamina for ourselves and stamina for our students so they can continue to work through these issues. So for folks who were on mute or who have muted me, sorry, welcome back. Please join us again. And we will jump back in, we'll come back to these issues, but we'll jump back into the discussion of the equity model. So first, this paper that we were fortunate to have published in July, it's been an ongoing process of developing it since about 2017. We were at the food systems, teaching food systems community of practice, hosted by Columbia University, and one of the sessions there was a very wonderful question of what are the key competencies that students need to develop, or that we need to help students develop in our food systems education programs. And so we took about an hour and a half or so to think about, discuss, and try to articulate some key competencies. But one particular key competency stood out as kind of being at the center or foundation for the work we should be doing, but also one of the areas that very few people in the room felt confident that they were doing or that they knew how to do. And that was around issues of equity, issues of racial equity, social justice, understanding forms of oppression, and bringing that into our classrooms. So a smaller group from that session continued to work on this issue and thinking about, right, this was identified as a key issue, but it seems like as a whole our group isn't prepared to bring this right into our classrooms, although there's this need. So we wanted to figure out, to what extent do programs, sustainable food system education programs, and to say that sustainable food system education isn't the only term that programs fall under. There's critical food systems education, there's education for food systems transformation, there's food studies, critical food studies, food pedagogy. There's lots of terms, but we kind of group them under this one term for now, to groups that are working with food system content and topics, and often focus on systems thinking, interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary collaboration, and community-based experiential learning types of projects. So we looked at these types of programs in Canada and the United States to see if folks were addressing the issues of equity explicitly. So we looked at public-facing documents, kind of taking the perspective of if you were a student or another instructor or administrator, and thinking, what are others doing in my field? What could you find from looking at and public-facing documents? Program learning descriptions, learning outcomes, any curricula that was available. And the second part was, we were hoping to propose a succinct or discover, actually initially we wanted to discover an existing equity competency model that was a peer-reviewed model that we could incorporate into our own practice. We didn't quite find that, so we drew from multiple fields and perspectives to propose one that is to articulate one for sustainable food systems education programs. So we go into more depth into the methods and the inclusion, exclusion, the types of terms we use in the paper, and I'm hoping to, if you're interested, we can discuss those, but for now I'm just going to briefly skim that type of detail because I really want to leave time for us to discuss the teaching activities. We identified about 108 programs in the United States and Canada that would fall under our criteria for sustainable food system education programs. We reviewed public-facing documents, and we found that just over 80% of the universities with these programs do not provide evidence that they explicitly include equity in their curricula. And so that surprised us. We were hoping it would be higher. We were hoping that we would find and be able to build off leadership from other groups. And there are groups doing this, but we found that there's possibly a widespread lack of explicit integration based on what we saw from public-facing documents. That second objective, to propose an equity competency model based on literature from multiple fields and perspectives, that led us to looking at, of course, the food systems education. There's a growing scholarship, peer-reviewed scholarship around how folks are framing, articulating their competencies or their learning outcomes, or the philosophical underpinnings for their educational programs. Same for education for sustainability. There is a growing body of literature around competency, articulating competencies and competency models specific for education for sustainability. In diversity, cultural, multicultural education, there are competency models that are similar to and related to equity. As well in the literature on planning and nursing, social work, multicultural counseling. We also looked at the Center for Social Inclusion, some of their publications on racial equity in the food system. So we drew upon about 18 different sources and noticed some distinct themes, noticed some areas that appeared in some but not in others, and that we thought would be appropriate for food system education based on the literature and the nature of the projects, or the nature of the programs. And so we coalesced these together into what we call our equity competency model. And this model has 4 dimensions. And I want to highlight that these dimensions, for the most part, there's a lot of overlap with other forms of competencies that are being articulated and developed in our in programs and in the literature and in existing programs. But these were unique enough, we felt, to bundle together under the umbrella of an equity competency. So we had, and this is common, is we begin with, or the first dimension is an awareness of self. From there, it's that awareness of others and one's interactions with them, awareness of systems of oppression, and then the 4th dimension is the strategies and tactics for dismantling inequity. And so within this competency model, we focus on knowledge, skills, attitudes, and practices that bundled together are often referred to as a competency. And I'll just go through them a bit more specifically, each of these dimensions and some of the statements that are associated with them, before passing it on to my colleagues who will kind of operationalize, show how these are showing up in their actual teaching practices. So first, the awareness of self. Many programs that work on interdisciplinarity, that work on student, even metacognitive development in a domain general sense, get students to think more about themselves, their learning styles, how their collaboration styles, their conflict management styles. For us, explicitly, we wanted our students to focus on issues of social and cultural location, looking at their implicit and explicit biases, as well as developing that capacity for preventative self-care in order to remain productive. So helping students recognize their affective responses, helping students recognize what they need to do to stay healthy, to stay in the game, and be generative and develop that stamina to have hard conversations, to talk about these really challenging issues. So the awareness of self domain is the first domain where we start, where our students are better understanding themselves, which then leads to, because our courses are often are situated in a lot of collaborative learning styles, but also collaboration with community-based projects or community-based organizations. So we wanted to, within this equity competencies model, really emphasize that our students don't just need to know themselves, they also need to recognize others' values and beliefs and experiences that enhance or limit their ability to engage and recognize forms of social oppression. So recognize the extent to which social cultural structures and values may oppress, marginalize, alienate, or enhance privilege and powers in other lives is a big part of this domain within our model, as well as tailoring communication strategies and active listening strategies to effectively express and adapt. to others, to establish relationships, to further collective action. So you'll see collective action come up in relationships a lot in this model, because our ultimate goal is to align our equity model with a collective action competency as well. We want our students to understand, recognize, and witness, and then maybe participate in collective action projects whose goals are to help dismantle forms of inequity in the food system. So you'll see collective action pop up a bit, because ultimately that's where we want to lead our students towards practicing in their undergraduate programs, graduate programs, but also once they leave, to continue the practice of collective action to address systemic issues. The third domain, and this one I think is a bit more challenging for natural sciences, health sciences. We often don't look back historically to what's happened. All curriculums are full. It'd be lovely to teach everything. It's not possible. However, we want to emphasize how important it is for natural scientists and folks in the health sciences to really understand that our current realities are based on historical precedent, and not just subjective events or interpretations, actual objective evidence of systemic expressions of oppression. Unfortunately, if you're in North America, you're governing at all levels. We're settler colonial system, colonization. We have very specific examples of how oppression has occurred, how it has crept into legislation intentionally to oppress certain groups within society, and how the outcomes of those types of forms of structural racism, structural oppression, are impacting populations right now. So for us, that examining the current and historical systemic expressions of racism and their intersection with class, gender, and other forms of systemic oppression is a key part of this equity competency model. Our students need to know how we've structured our society, how we continue to build off of and structure a society that maintains forms of oppression. And then the last domain is more of that domain of application, more of the domain of the performance of a competency. And it is beginning with, again, that knowledge, the awareness of the historical and current strategies of resistance. So there is much going on. There's much that has been going on that we can learn from. We're not starting fresh. There are ideas, there is scholarship, there's debate to help us move, can help us move more quickly, to bring us up to speed to forms of strategies and resistance that have occurred or are occurring. There are policy solutions out there, strategic opportunities to create more racially equitable food systems, to use the knowledge of the effects of oppression when co-developing our strategies for social justice interventions. The fourth statement within this domain is really about taking an asset-based community development approach. So recognizing that academia and the development of expertise often is associated with the development of, or with harmful ways of engaging with other communities, dismissing, disappearing ways of knowing experiences, taking a deficit approach, having an expert come in thinking they know what to do, and that the folks that are being helped are lacking any understanding of what's going on and need the help from outsiders. We really want to dismantle that in particular, and so through an asset-based community development lens, our strategies and tactics section really emphasizes that need to both reframe and then embody that when engaging with communities. And then that co-formulating of strategies and tactics. So making sure that our students recognize that they have expertise, they have skill sets, but there are limitations to their expertise and skill sets, and they need to match and co-create and co-formulate with folks who are experiencing, with folks in community, with folks that have the lived experience and understanding of what's going on to take steps towards collective action. So those are our 4 domains. You'll likely, if you're familiar with competency literature, you'll see the overlap with other competencies. If it's civic engagement competencies, collaboration, interdisciplinarity, developing metacognitive skills, there are these elements within other competencies that we're likely developing. we wanted to put them together specifically with language and with an orientation towards dismantling systems of oppression and addressing issues of equity in the food system. So for us, that's a great thing. That means we're already working on some elements of this. It's just that how can we be a bit more explicit and specific with how we frame and develop criteria for addressing equity in our food system. So from here, and if you have questions about this, we'll have the discussion time. Love to talk a bit further, but I'd like to pass along to my colleagues so they can further articulate and operationalize what we mean in this equity model through their own practice currently. So our first speaker is Dr. Nicole Tichenor Blackstone from Tufts University. Dr. Joanne Burke will, unfortunately, Dr. Koch, Pamella Koch couldn't join us today due to family challenges right now. So Joanne will present Pamella's work as well, and then Molly will follow up with some examples from her practice at Middlebury College. So I'm hoping, so for Nicole, for all of our speakers, if you want to just tell me to advance the slides, I'll push them I'll mute myself and then I'll advance the slides for you. And so we'll start first with Nicole Blackstone, Tichenor Blackstone from Tufts University.
Great, thanks so much, Will. Can folks hear me all right? Thanks, perfect. Okay, so as Will said, my name is Nicole Tichenor Blackstone. I teach at Tufts University in the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. The program that I primarily teach in is called the Agriculture, Food, and Environment program. It's an interdisciplinary graduate degree within a school of nutrition, so within a health sciences school. The course I'm going to speak about in reference to is a course called Fundamentals of U.S. Agriculture that I'm actually teaching right now. This is the first course in our required agriculture, science, and policy sequence that all of our AFE students, Agriculture, Food, and Environment students take. And this is actually a course where we widen the lens from sort of natural and environmental and agricultural sciences to include political, historical, cultural context as a foundational course for our degree program. So the learning outcomes, they're kind of structured in a non-traditional way to be a little catchy. So the first is that food is complicated, so describing how economic, political, ecological, and social forces shape the structure and outcomes of U.S. agriculture over time. The importance of people and the importance of exploring stakeholder perspectives, including their own perspectives and positions within U.S. agriculture as current eaters and workers and future professionals in this space. The activity I'm going to describe includes, it is a small group, large group discussion combination that includes some pre-work with readings, a little bit of online lecture, some guided discussion questions, and we assess it with something that I call a minute paper that I'll talk about in a second. The domains that these activities correspond to, and Will, just one second. Do I have more slides on this, or is this my only? Okay, great. I have detailed slides. Perfect. The domains that this activity corresponds to in terms of our competency model. So we are really thinking about our own social and cultural locations with this activity and how this relates to working with others and engaging in U.S. agricultural history, explicitly examining systemic oppression and inequities in the food system, in particular with a focus on racism and genocide of indigenous peoples. So next slide. So the activity is focused on a segment of the course where we learn about pre-1930s agricultural policy, with sort of the New Deal in the 1930s being a turning point in ag policy. So they have a required online lecture. They listen to the 1619 Project podcast about how sort of slavery and capitalism are tied up together in the development of agriculture and the economy in the United States. Reading about genocide of indigenous peoples through the framing of the U.S. Department of the Historian. And the activity that we use is a small group discussion. This year we did it on Zoom. Usually we're in the classroom. and a whole class wrap up together. So the students have about half an hour to discuss the prompts I'm about to show you. And we wrap up with this, the only prompt I give them is, what was something insightful that another member of your group shared with you today? And that is an attempt for us to all kind of practice active listening in the classroom. Also just being really explicit in the session prior to frame this discussion, since this is really tough content for some students, particularly from marginalized identities, our Black students, and folks with Indigenous backgrounds. So we frame the discussion with the learning objectives of the course and acknowledge that we have different starting points in the material explicitly as a way to sort of prep folks for the conversation that's going to come. I provide the discussion questions ahead of time and invite students to reflect and prepare kind of what they want to share, or if they want to pass, that sort of thing in class. And then in this course, really central, we have group agreements or group norms that are co-created at the beginning of the semester. And this is a sort of point in the semester where we check back in on those group agreements, and I have the students read chunks of them out loud to one another so we can all be reminded that we need to be accountable to one another. Next slide. So here are the discussion questions, and I'll just go through this very rapidly because I'm running out of time. Asking them to examine their own position and perspective regarding ag issues, and how the readings and media that they engaged with this week challenged, changed, or affirmed a perspective they had about ag history, and how that positionality they think plays into that perspective they may have had. And then asking them to sort of interrogate these agricultural policies or land policies that we are focusing on, and asking them if they are both revolutionary, oppressive, or both. And that kind of allows them to think about, so who, for whom, right? For whom was this revolutionary or oppressive? And we start running into themes. Next slide. So I'll end on this. The assessment I have, and I'll probably make this more structured over time, but this is an assessment I have in every class session that I do in teaching. I ask students for what they're most confused about, kind of anonymously, and the most important thing they learned in the class. And so just wanted to share some takeaways from this particular session, that some of the most impactful takeaways were, I'll just read briefly because I think I have a little bit of time. So I found it very impactful to learn about the bond system in which mortgages were able to be taken out against human lives. The system was a major way in which people who claimed to be against slavery and exempt from blame were also directly financially benefiting from its continuation. As incredible as the vast expansion of the US was, it was interesting to note perspective for white men and families. I could see how this American dream was revolutionary, and how the US started developing its image as a world leader and something to strive for. However, as the podcast drove home, this was not the case for just about any other human, the effects of which they are still suffering from today, and that we're all still suffering from today. So I'll leave you with that. And this is an exercise I've done for 2 years now, since 1619 came out last year, and I'm happy to share anything else folks are interested in with this activity.
Hi, thanks so much, Nicole and Will and all for allowing this platform. So as Will had said, Joanne Burke, I had been a teacher at the University of New Hampshire in the Department of Ag, Nutrition, and Food Systems. And the particular integration that I'll be focusing on is an enrichment experience that's built into the community nutrition course. So this is an upper level course. It serves dietetics majors, it serves our wellness majors, some of our sustainable ag and food systems folks. But it's sort of the equivalent. This might be one of the first courses that our nutrition majors and dietetics program majors have that is more public health oriented than here are the nutrients and what you do. So it's important that we think about systems and how are people impacted by this food system. So for me, in terms of adding this enrichment experience, the goal is that we need to recognize that undoing racism really requires a recognition of its existence and pervasiveness in social, political, economic, and environmental domains. Some of these specific outcomes that I didn't list all the outcomes for the course, but for those of you who run dietetics and nutrition programs and you're trying to address competencies, the course itself addresses multiple competencies. And so what we do is for those who elect to go into this enrichment experience, which really highlights what Will was talking about, it builds in an opportunity to dig deeper, to really assess and reflect about issues that may have just been commonly covered at the surface. So the activity is when students elect to do this enrichment, they submit weekly reflections based on the annual Food Solutions New England 21-Day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge, which is offered in the spring each year, as is this community nutrition course. And it is based on daily readings and prompts. So for the students, they sign up for the national challenge. Usually the sign up starts happening in February and March. But then they are also, they sign up with me for a modified commitment in that if they want to respond every day nationally, they can join the national discourse. But for extra credit for this enrichment, they need to do just 3 weekly reflections on 3 of the days, 3 of the 5 days, Monday through Friday. There are prompts that are given, and then they are directly sent to me. So I'm not trying to read all the national response on the platform. The students in my class know if they've made the commitment to the challenge, they're going to send in those reflection papers. And there's a lot of framing. It's not just a prompt, but on the national website, there's discussion. They can elect, oh, I want to see a video on this topic. Oh, I think I want to do a reading. And so they have this set of 3 reflections. The goal is not to have them do all 9 at the end. The idea is to encourage that immersion, that process that you would use as you do a journey, a learning journey. And then at the end, there's also a 3 to 5 page paper. It's a soft landing on what they really want to do on that sort of synthesizes, you started here, you're now here, what are you thinking about? So the equity competencies, it is addressing multiple. Next slide. Since Will spent a lot of time discussing each one, depending on what the students think about, 3 of the 4 are really capable or addressed, I think, very specifically. So next slide. So really what happens is, because this is an enrichment experience, I don't want it optional for my community nutrition students not to have a foundation in race, equity, and bias. So knowing that the challenge is in April usually, and I'm part of that development team since its launch, I make sure in my community class that we have touched on some of the seminal papers on race, dismantling racism, bias in the food system, food justice prior to the launch. One, to get them interested in doing it, but also to know in my own, in our own university process, that we are not just adding this as an add-on. Earlier in the day, we heard how central equity has to be. So this is integrated, so all students are exposed in New Hampshire, and the language. So in the University of New Hampshire, that's over on the East Coast, northern East Coast, it is a very white state. We are 90% and white, and thankfully we've moved up. We used to be 95%. So diversity is a challenge, and what I find is language matters, as we all know. And one of the things is really looking at the language we use in food system education. The issue of white privilege. For many of our students, they're working 2 and 3 jobs. They're barely making ends meet, and So when you say white privilege, they're sort of thinking, oh, I'm not in that 1%. I'm not a billionaire. I don't feel privileged. If for me, when introducing it, talking about your white advantage, it helps them be open to seeing, oh, they may have had a white advantage, and that is what we're talking about. So I would say, if you're going to integrate in your course, be sure you do some of that foundational work. And then there's just very specific instructions. We help them sign up for the challenge. They know they're going to receive Monday through Friday prompts. They are going to do the reflection papers. I do not like correcting papers, but I have to tell you, when I'm reading these, it helps me. It helps me appreciate when they say, I wish we had talked about this freshman year, to come back to my faculty. So there's a schedule for setting it up. They know the faculty, my TAs are not correcting it. I will be directly in charge of that. And it's really just a pass fail. It's as long as they were, as long as they really responded to the readings. But, and it's of a 600-point class, it's 10 additional points, because I don't want them falsely entering, but I want to acknowledge the work. Most of the students always complete. And during the whole process, because of the materials that we're using from diverse places, we are highlighting the ways in which there's so many places to gather insight perspectives. I also provide feedback. A student has a question, a student's frustrated, a student feels embarrassed that she's had this white or he's had this. So it's a great opportunity to connect with students in a one-on-one thoughtful way. Sometimes it's by direct comments to their work. Oh, I really like how you integrated your thinking with what we're talking about in class, or wow, what a rich way for you to move forward. So authentically calling out quickly, because I have a large class, but it has worked remarkably well. Next slide. So every year, Food Solutions New England is a collaborative six-state approach. We have a racial equity team, and my colleague Karen Spiller, who you saw before, and we work together on these slides. We're reviewing materials, suggestions from people. Somebody wants to be on the team, let me know. But it's a way too that in that review of materials, we engage in another course, our graduate level dietetic interns, to review materials, to use the Michigan State Guide and say, okay, there's resources here. Why would this work, not work? As a student, how do you see that? So multiple ways for students to engage. The discussions are rich, and people center on amazing student richness. Is just, it'll make you want to correct papers or to provide feedback. Really fun to see and heartwarming to see the aha moments. But also I think it says this is a call, that this is not just an add-on. It has to be integrated. So, and then as I said, those other resources serve as a way forward. Next slide. So again, most students complete the challenge, which is really fun to see, that they have the commitment, they feel it's manageable. There's prompts Monday through Friday, weekends you're given time to reflect. The vast majority have said, thank you. I just hadn't thought about this way. I'm seeing things differently. I had not noticed. For my dietetic students, saying, we need to think more about equity in so many ways, and how we address size, and how we address cultures more than just what people eat or what we read in a textbook. It's unique, it's personal. So a couple of the quotes that were, that I pulled, I like the readings, the prompts made me think more deeply. I was open to learning, but I know the challenge helped me learn and understand more. And this student actually went on to become a Vista in New York and is doing great things. She already had an interest in social justice, but really fun to see that. The second quote is really from a student who had taken the challenge and took it again. I have it in a couple of courses. And so she was speaking to her growth in that. So I'll let you read that at your leisure in the interest of time. But I believe that all health professionals should have the opportunity. So I thought that was a good quote. Next slide. And this one just really saying that they just have that chance to go deep and breath and deep. So now I'll move on to, and I'm happy with it, as is anyone, to take any questions or send me an email if I can help further.
And Joanne, for the next one, just to, we want to leave some time for the discussion, and Molly's going to present as well. So for this next one, maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Sure. Yep. So these are from Pam, Koch, who couldn't come today because of it. But what she does is she brings in an experience using the amount of dollars in what a SNAP recipient would get. And one of the things that Pam shared with me is she does not call it a SNAP challenge. A challenge sounds like a game. This is not a game for people. This is the lived reality. So she really aligns it and frames it as experiential learning. And you can see the equity models it represents. And next slide, please. These are the readings. These are well-established, Jane Poppendieck's work, Maggie Dickinson, and Molly will be talking to us, but really, again, SNAP represents a system failure. It's not just for nutritionists to think about, are SNAP dollars going to be cut this year? It's that big picture view of why are so many people needing to apply to SNAP. Next slide, please. So with the activity itself, is trying to eat on a SNAP budget, which is about $40 a week, and for 7 days. And then they write a reflection paper on that experience. You know, surely the Pam highlights some of the limits of this activity. Many of these students can drive in a car and go around stores for the best bargain. Many of the students have cooking facilities. Many of the students are in a nutrition program, so they probably like to cook and have some of those skills, but it also dismantles some of this feeling that if our nutrition educators are thinking, well, we have to help those poor people who don't know how to cook. And you're like, no, actually, many people who are in under-recessed households know how to cook, know what our healthy foods are. They might not financially be able to execute that. So a lot of dismantling preconceived notions of how do you stretch your food dollar that you don't really have to stretch. Next slide. So these are some of the awareness that the kind of shaming that goes on, that happens. So when I'll just read. When I realized my family food stamps, I was in elementary school. In school, my peers would make fun of children who had food stamps. I would get upset when my mom would send me to the store to buy groceries because I had this fear that someone from school could see me. Thankfully, there's EBT, but there's also still programs where kids are going home with backpacks of food, which is very visible. So an immediate need of not going hungry for the weekend, but then we have the whole social shaming. And what I loved about the experience is it gave me the opportunity to talk to family and friends. I was able to educate a lot of them on how difficult it is really to live on SNAP. I discovered that no one really knows much about it. I am devastated about the news of Trump's cuts to SNAP because of especially because of the corona pandemic. Those of us in the US are speechless over the president's othering of hungry and low-income individuals. And then the whole idea of SNAP, and we know from the data coming out of Hopkins and nationally that SNAP recipients and minorities are much more susceptible to pandemic realities. Next slide, please. And again, that it opens awareness of oppression. Okay, I think I'll let people, at least these are here to read. And I think that's it on those, right, Will? So hopefully, Molly, I talk fast enough and people can access the slides. Thanks.
We'll have these posted after, as well as other resources associated with the presentation. Thanks so much, Joanne. So we'll pass it along to Molly.
It would help if I unmute. Thanks. So I want to talk about an exercise I use in a course called Food, Power, and Justice. It's an elective, but it's turned out to be a really popular class. Last spring, I ended up teaching teaching it twice over because I had on the wait list enough students to populate the course 3 times over. But it's part of a food studies program at Middlebury that students can either do an undergraduate minor or basically create their own major in food studies. We've had several students who end up doing that. The learning outcomes of the course are understanding how race, class, and gender and their intersectionality play significant roles in inequity, in opportunity, in health outcomes related to food access, and in political participation in the food system. A lot in the course about power analysis, how we do that, and where the sources of power are in the US food system. And then finally, basic food literacy, using the knowledge that students get from the class to interpret what they read about changes and trends in food and agriculture. For instance, to interpret what's happening when Trump tries to minimize SNAP benefits, or when Congress does that. The activity I want to talk about involves pre-readings, responses to prompts on a discussion forum on Canvas, a lecture, and a plenary discussion. And the assessment is based on the discussion forum. It's an assessment not just of responses to this one prompt, but responses throughout the semester, and whether those responses seem to be deepening and whether the students are able to synthesize across readings. The equity competency connections for me are building awareness of historical and current strategies and projects of resistance at the individual and collective scales, and also identifying policy solutions. And let me just say one sentence here, that I'm also working on a project in the United States to develop a food policy, a US national food policy, which we don't have in the United States. We have the Farm Bill, but no food policy. And that I bring observations from that project back into class to try to let students see that I'm involved in this actively as one of their professors. I have a commitment to this and really want to see it happen. So next slide. These were the readings for this particular session, which was focused on who decides about food policy. One thing about national food policy councils as a more democratic option to deciding about food policy. And then two contrasting readings that in the activity, I asked students to compare. One was a red deal, which is something, it's an indigenous food policy that was created to really center the needs of indigenous people. And I wanted students in the activity to compare it to the Green New Deal. And I asked them to read the agricultural sections of this green stimulus to rebuild the economy. And let me just say, before we go on to the activity and what students got out of it, let me just say that this built onto previous courses, previous classes in which we had talked at length about oppression of indigenous people and health discrepancies that indigenous people suffer. For instance, the really high rates of COVID in Navajo communities in the United States, which do not have running water. Between 15 and 40% of the households have no running water, which makes a joke out of the recommendations to be washing their hands frequently. Many of them don't have electricity. So a lot of really major health issues. And I have realized during the years I've been teaching this course that I am focusing more and more on indigenous people, less on Black. I started out just talking about racism in the food system with just a little nod to, well, indigenous people are having problems too. But with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the publicity about COVID and the health discrepancies in COVID incidents and hospitalizations between Black and white populations, I am moving more and more to focusing on indigenous issues in this class because I think people don't understand them nearly as much. And especially with projects like the 1619 project that Nicole is using, the public awareness of injustices that Black people have suffered, it has grown. the injustices that Indigenous people have suffered, basically the theft of their entire land base, or virtually their entire land base. We have never come to grips with that in the United States, and we really are not dealing with it. So next slide. This is the discussion prompt. It's basically just comparing this red deal that was inspired by Indigenous activists with the Green New Deal. Oops, there's my timer that says I'm up to 6 minutes, but I think just have one more slide. And then I really wanted for students to understand the aspects of Indigenous philosophy that were coming through in the red deal, so that they understood a little bit more. The course begins with some readings by Robin Wall Kimmerer that contrast the cosmovision of Indigenous people with a white cosmovision. Go on to the next slide, Will, and this will be my last slide here. Sample responses, and I was really pleased with what the students got out of this, that the red deal is centering Indigenous treaty rights, really focused on land restoration, food sovereignty, self-determination, decolonization, and liberation, not just equity, but liberation. And they also really understood that the red deal brings up anti-capitalism, and decolonization adds those to the social justice struggle, and adds things like divesting from institutions that are perpetrating racial inequity, and also brings in this thing that's very strong in Indigenous cosmovisions of a caretaking economy, not the capitalist economy that's based on wealth and what you can afford to buy, but a caretaking economy. And I'll leave it there because I've gone a minute over my deadline, but I'm open to questions that come up during discussion. Thanks, Will.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. So at this point, I'll stop sharing my screen for now, and we'd love to encourage or invite folks to comments, questions, however we'd like to proceed for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers. So much content there. That was really wonderful. So much to think about. And I really appreciated the sharing of some very tangible assignments and your reflection and experience with those. It would be so wonderful if you can share those. We can post those on our website, and so people can kind of explore those further, and then we can have a sandbox discussion about those later. Please feel free to type questions and comments and reflections in the chat box, or you could feel free to unmute your mic. I can't see everybody at once, but yes, either the chat box or just unmute yourself.
I'm happy to jump in. I can't help myself. But I'd love to hear from folks who are teaching in agroecology as well. So we've talked about health, some health science perspectives, but how are others engaging in this type of material or bringing it into agroecological oriented courses or programs? Would be a fascinating one. Not to put anyone on the spot, if there's anyone focusing on agroecology, I think there might be a few. But that's one area that I think we didn't talk about as explicitly, and it would be lovely to hear from the crowd how they do that.
Will, if I could jump in, there's a question about how BIPOC students react to these activities. And let me say, Middlebury has very few Indigenous students. We do have an Abenaki population in Vermont, but very, very few Indigenous students. We do have a few Indigenous students who are internationals who come into Middlebury. And we have increasing numbers of Black American students. And let me say the BIPOC students have been hugely appreciative of the food, power, and justice class generally, but specifically activities that are looking at racial inequities or racial liberation and how different groups are striving for liberation. I always try to talk not just about the problems, but about how different groups are achieving success, even if the success seems very modest from the outside. It's important to the people who are involved in them. And the BIPOC students tend to be very vocal. I had an Ethiopian student who corrected my language at one point. I was talking about African Americans. And she said, actually, these are Black Americans. These are not African Americans. And it made a lot of sense. Her family came from Ethiopia and they had ties there. I didn't understand that distinction, and I thanked her for correcting me. And ever since, when I'm talking about Black Americans, I talk about Black Americans and don't use that African Americans unless they truly do have strong roots in African culture. And I can answer to one other question while I've got the little yellow line around my box about whether anyone integrates discussion about people living with disabilities. I had a absolutely marvelous independent scholar student last year, he just graduated, who did his whole work about how agroecology can incorporate people with disabilities and how that is so frequently left out, but what an important thing it is to make sure that we are talking about disability access as well. And he kind of, I mean, in the way that students do, and one of the reasons why so many of us are teachers, our students open our eyes to things that we hadn't been aware of.
I would add to Molly's in a different course, and this was an interdisciplinary course. One of the and we were working with individuals with stroke who had had a stroke, so different healthcare professionals. But one thing we were chatting about is that instead of the word disabilities, could we move to different abilities? And so I think that's really our language matters. And I would say, can we embrace that? Because disability sounds so much like you're less than. But really, in fact, the people with different abilities are amazing for how they've adapted, conquered, and navigate. So I'll just throw that out there as an aside that I think that would be fun to, I think that would be an important way to elevate humanity in general.
I'll just add something briefly. With the particular activity that I mentioned, I've only done that a couple of years and it's gone fairly well with a lot of scaffolding around it. I shared some of it in my presentation, and it's also like very well known with my students. I have an open door policy and want to be told how I'm doing things wrong and how to better address their learning on an ongoing basis. I will share, just in general, teaching a course that focuses on so many dimensions of oppression that are felt very differently by our BIPOC students. It has been in a classroom that is majority white, sometimes by an overwhelming margin, is a real challenge. And I have had Black students speak with me about how frustrating it is to be in that classroom and to feel basically alone sometimes, even though I'm trying to do everything I can to create a supportive environment. But essentially things like, why aren't my classmates seeing that this is about, like another example, that this is about race? Why are we not talking about race in this particular moment? You know, just getting very frustrated and feeling alone. So I want to acknowledge that this is not all rosy and easy and yay, you know, this is hard, and that it can be really challenging for our BIPOC students despite best efforts. And there's only so much that we can do as individual instructors, I think, to to change the environment, and we also have to simultaneously be changing the systems that are creating the environments where my classrooms are majority white.
I'd love to jump in on and add to what Nicole's saying. So the class in which I bring this up the most is it's 160 students in the class, and it's predominantly not white. And I would say that most BIPOC students aren't enjoying the feeling of this being brought up, and even sometimes the expectation that they will be champions and they will stand up in lecture in a white supremacist institution, and like they know exactly what happens to those uppity people of color when they start outing themselves as having these thoughts. So they, for the most part, don't feel comfortable talking about these. Some do. I've been trying to not center my white students and their feelings. And some of my activities are more about calling out white students to participate, to be aware of their biases. Yeah, I think for my, I'm currently on sabbatical, but when I return back to teaching, I'm going to focus more on developing safer spaces to allow BIPOC students to feel comfortable, because I don't think I've been doing that very well. And I think because of who I am, I have been really naive to the impacts of white supremacist colonizing or colonial institutions, and the strategies people have been using for, I guess, centuries now to adapt and to not put themselves into those situations. And this will come up, I think Sharon might talk about this as well. For my program, we have one course that talks about this, and we go very quickly all in. And for me, that is a recipe for likely re-traumatizing folks, because it needs to be scaffolded, it needs to be spread out. It can't just be like, oh, and in this class, we're gonna all of a sudden talk about these issues, and then we're gonna pretend they don't exist in other classes. Like, how helpful is that? So it's a really great question. How do BIPOC students experience this? It's very diverse, but from what I've seen in my practice, a lot of like freezing and not wanting to stand up and champion these causes. Although in their reflections and in other areas for saying, I appreciate this, I'm excited that we're talking about these things, but when it comes to like in-face in lecture, not so much.
So I want to just jump in. I mentioned that I run a program at Columbia University. It's primarily a nutrition science program. We barely ever talked about food, never mind people. And in part because of the work we've done as a community of practice and the willingness of our faculty to integrate some of these issues centrally into our curriculum, we revamped, and also because of the timing of George Floyd, the double pandemic, et cetera, we've revamped our entire curriculum. I want to try to integrate some of the questions that have come up, but use the analogy of feeling like at one point we were literally in the middle of a tornado between all of the things that were happening and literally having to switch from in-person to remote learning. And I think where our inclination was to respond quickly to the force of the tornado. And ultimately what we did was go into the basement and really regroup and think long and hard as a faculty, along with our students, about what we could do this current year to change the entire focus of the curriculum to make sure that students understand what inequities undergird nutrition-related chronic diseases and the disparities. And one of the overarching things that we're trying to work with, not only within our program, within the university as a whole, is trying, on the one hand, to recognize that each marginalized person, family, group, or community has a unique experience about the story and the history of the marginalization. On the other hand, the common aspect of not feeling like they belong and or are included. So when we did our sessions focused on Black Lives Matter, we really tried to get right at the root of the question of why is that such a controversial topic, and why are we choosing to focus on Black Lives Matter right now? And it doesn't mean we're not focused and equally interested in hearing and understanding about anyone who feels marginalized, including BIPOC, including sexual orientation, including ability, etc. So what we ended up doing was focusing, as I mentioned, on Black Lives Matter, also on microaggression, because the experience of having been a microaggressor or being microaggressed really opened up the whole discussion to different ways that we may have been felt marginalized ourselves or marginalized others. So I can talk with others about how we tried to sequence that. And then the other thing we tried to do is look at the entire curriculum, because in our case, what students said is happening a lot at Columbia is there would be maybe an orientation entirely focused on this, or as Will said, a course entirely focused on this, and then they wouldn't see it in any other aspect of the curriculum. So staging it and taking the time to, as I said, stay in the basement a little while and think about a longer term plan. The wrong history that we all learned. I mean, I said I felt like I was a 64-year-old woman who lived under a rock for my whole life, and I had to come out from under the rock, and at the same time deal with, as you have, all of these challenges. So the students appreciated our validating the fact that we've learned the wrong history. They appreciated the idea that we don't expect our Black or BIPOC students or ability students or whatever to be the educators. And then the only other thing that I would say about, because there's a question about how we've been training our faculty, et cetera, and I can talk with whomever asked that. So one of the challenges we're seeing at Columbia, I imagine you're seeing it also, is we're putting so much pressure on people who are the experts to help facilitate discussions. And so we're looking at different models to try to mitigate that. I don't think I've answered anything, but those are some of the challenges we've been facing.
I think, Sharon, just to quickly tag team, one, thinking about this very nature of this webinar to help all of us gain the skill and will, as Karen Spiller would say, one of our colleagues, that instructors do not like to get in a classroom and not feel like they know what to say next. And many of us don't have that rich history. And so I think when you make that commitment, and it's a lifelong journey, like Molly was saying, at first Indigenous wasn't right on her radar, but now it is. So I will blatantly, say that our community of practice is a great way to network and to keep that own professional growing, to allow yourself to say, this is uncomfortable, this is hard for me as an instructor. It's much easier for me to talk calories and nutrients than to go into this domain. But this is the important critical work. And then we have, of course, the National 21-Day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge at Food Solutions. All the materials are there. You can enter in, you can do some of the readings. And if you decide to join in April, we started at 400 people last year, over 7,000 people participated across the nation. So it's a great way to enter in at some point. No right or wrong answer, but I think you need to give yourselves permission of the leaning in, the relationship building, and going back to other people saying, having those course agreements where you're not calling out people nastily, you're saying, we're going to enter this with respect and caring, and if the language starts down a different route, we're going to stop. We have the permission to stop because we said we're going to be respectful. So just some quick thoughts.
So thank you, Joanne. I just want to add, so Rosie, if you, I'm sorry, not Stephanie, if you want more information about the process and personal reflection of the educators, I'm happy to talk with you. Glenn is mentioning the training for having difficult dialogues. That's absolutely part of, so some of these, just like our foundational components of building equity competencies, are foundations that undergird those. And definitely, and the whole concept of being comfortable with silence, especially on Zoom when you're like looking at yourself and you're looking, you don't know who's looking at what. So those are big challenges. And the mental health component is really, really, really important. So checking in with yourself, with your faculty, with your students, trying to, on the one hand, understand that silence is completely understandable in these moments, and it also may reflect some kind of withdrawal and protective mechanism. So we always check in, we check in regularly with our students.
Regarding the mental health, probably not enough. Institutions probably not doing enough. Part of something that my institution, my school specifically, not the university, has started implementing recently is a series of community conversations that are ad hoc sometimes, like in response to the verdict around Breonna Taylor's murder. There was a community conversation the day after that was facilitated by one of our associate directors for equity and inclusion, who is a younger woman that the students love and feel really comfortable with. And she's not a faculty member, and she's staff. And so kind of those spaces have been, I think, helpful for our students of color, but it's one kind of approach that is likely insufficient due to the just barrage of challenges that our students are facing. And so there are attempts, but they are likely insufficient, I would say, just to be completely honest.
If I could add one thing in relation to that, I think the tenor, the tone that your administrators set is really important. Mm-hmm. When they are sending out messages to the entire campus community, for instance, recognizing, acknowledging the pain around the verdict with Breonna Taylor, and telling students, we're here with you, we want to support you, and here's what you can do if you want to talk to others about it. I think that is really important. Middlebury is the first place that I have worked where the top administrators, like the president, are regularly sending out that kind of message of support to BIPOC students.
So you have a good working president. I'll leave it at that.
I have a few other kind of wrap-up activities I'd like to do as we're getting close to the 11th or the half past the hour. There's a great question I just wanted to talk a little bit about, and we have Dan Clegg as a postdoc that works with me. He's from counseling psychology, and he's helping me, and we're collectively looking more at like trauma-informed pedagogy. So how do we bring that into our teaching classroom? And again, for natural sciences, there was nothing in my past training to even the word trauma didn't even exist. So it's really that reaching out to those who are already doing this work and then doing that work yourself. I also have been waving this book around a lot on Zoom, My Grandmother's Hands. It's amazing, and it's by Resmaa Menakem, about this issue of white body supremacy and being attentive to the affect. And so I'd love to just try to bookend. I love, for some reason, beginning and endings are, I always try and force these on folks, but I'm going to share my screen to just kind of acknowledge a few elements of, where's my PowerPoint here? Here we go. Pastor, open it. Some of the key takeaways that we had discussed as a group that we want to reinforce before we close today. In the title of that paper really is just that towards an equity competency model, and I think the questions really hammer that in. Is that unfortunately for us and for most of our institutions, we're at the beginning of this, but at least we're beginning to make these strides forward. So we know that our model is, in some ways, as a colleague has said to me before, it's 20 years behind, but we can catch up and we can put our intentions towards to make this something that our programs and our students have at the center of their work. But it's inherently relational, which always takes time. It's beyond any one field, discipline, or domain. And it requires collaboration. And again, the silos and just the academia itself is really not a field that celebrates and promotes collaboration. Although I think within our disciplines and within food systems education, we're overcoming that. So collaboration within your classrooms and beyond, looking at the program level opportunities to develop in these equities, not trying to do it all in one course or all on your own. If you can, if you have a supportive environment, to really reach out to your colleagues and say, how are we building this competency? How are we having these hard discussions throughout our time with our students, not just in one course. And then coming back to the beginning, and I'd like to end with a bit of a body activity that we really need to attend to in science education. Often you're told like scientists don't bring emotion, don't bring feelings into science. We're objective, and really that's such a harmful statement and not even realistic. So attending to the responsibility of affective care for our students at all times, but also within when we know we're bringing up issues that will potentially re-traumatize folks. And it's also for the instructors, like recognizing whenever, for some of the lectures I do on race or gender, for the few days before it, I'm a bit of a mess. I'm all over the map, and it shows and it impacts. So I have to learn to develop the stamina to keep on going and to stay coherent and competent while being a part of this, as well as being more attentive to our students, our communities, and intergenerationally. So we are drawing on the historical, the historical responsibilities we need to bring into our courses, as well as thinking forward to the responsibilities of the future ancestors that are yet to come. Wait, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Will.
I was just gonna, we will post resources for the webinar recording. So our syllabi, our activities, we'll have them in addition to the recording to share.
So since we're going to have the recording, my comment about the presidency is at the national level. Our university president is fine, and I wouldn't want to leave that unclarified, although, anyway, thank you.
On the record.
On the record.
So if you don't mind, we could do a quick closing body activity. So modeling a little bit what we ought to consider bringing into our classrooms is that opening activity and the opening practices to get our students prepared for their affective responses and to build that stamina, as well as at the end of these activities too. So taking a few seconds to just settle back in, fix your posture if you're like me, horrible posture, breathe a bit deeply. And once you feel like your breath is kind of taking you to a different spot, a different feeling in your body, I want you to breathe in, hold your breath, raise your shoulders to your ears, tighten your jaws and your muscles, and just kind of hold that for 3 counts. And if you want to release loudly, or however you like to express your release, we'll do this for try this a few times, just to really tense up. And release. And so this activity is something that from Resmaa Menachen's book talks about. When we're experiencing these affective responses, it's important to be able to recognize them and not disappear them, but get used to managing them. But also we have to release the energy that gets built up. And the release is as important for the healing process as acknowledging that you're having these sensations. So this little like tightening and releasing is okay, but if you're feeling like there's a pent up energy, he recommends 20 minutes of activity, to release your energy. So running, walking, biking, dancing, gardening, physical labor, like maybe dancing, vacuuming at the same time, type of thing. And it actually makes a mention to maybe avoid activities like meditation or yoga or Tai Chi right after any affective response, because they can trap the energy versus letting it release. So think if today or at any time that you are engaging in issues of equity with your class or with your community partners in your research, or experiencing forms of oppression, that practices for releasing that energy, not holding on to it and letting it go, and to help us develop the stamina so we can keep at this work and keep bringing it together. So one last plug, there is a special call right now through Frontiers, Critical and Equity-Oriented Pedagogical Innovations in Sustainable Food Systems Education. A number of us on the call are part of the editorial board. We'd love for folks to share their practices, share their thoughts. It's not just on what we would consider a traditional research paper. There's reviews, there's perspectives, a number of forms of writing that you can submit around these issues. And I think the more we can put into the scholarly domain and share broadly our innovations, our thoughts, our worries, our perspectives, the better we can all work to catching up and moving forward in addressing these issues of equity in our classrooms, and then hopefully translating to issues of dismantling systems of oppression and inequities in our food system. And again, I just want to say, if you're interested in going further and being more and continuing to reach other folks, we have the Teaching Food Systems Community of Practice. There's the email there to get more involved. Also, a quick Google search will find the website, as well as the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association. For those interested, our website's down right now, but the Facebook page is up, and we're increasingly talking about these issues as well. So please consider joining and participating through these organizations as well. And we look forward to seeing you on our next Sandbox webinar series, October 22nd. So thanks so much, Selena. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it back to you if you have any closing thoughts. And thanks so much to to everyone who came and shared and asked questions, listened, and thanks so much to my colleagues for co-presenting with me. I really appreciate it. This is one of my favorite groups that I get to Zoom with. So thanks so much, and I'll pass it back to Selena.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers. That was really wonderful. My mind is spinning because you gave me so many ideas. And then thank you to all of the participants for joining. I know these are long webinars, and I think we're just all getting so much out of it. If you have recommendations for speakers, please email me or us, and we would love to try to coordinate that. And yeah, thank you all. There's great resources you all shared, so thank you, and hope to see you in 2 weeks from now on Thursday, October 22nd for Ren Walker Robbins webinar. So thank you, and have a beautiful weekend. Willa, can you stay on for a second? Awesome.
Great.
I'm going to stop recording.